It's been a weekend of attacks, from lone wolf man who stabbed two women in Marseille in France to a lone wolf driver with an ISIS flag on his front seat who drove into a police picket and stabbed a policeman in Canada. And now to another kind of lone wolf attack in the land of liberal gun licenses. How differently do Europe and the United States handle terrorism from Islamist groups? Senior foreign editor Padma Rao examines this question.
It's not been long since a man mowed down 14 people with his truck in Barcelona in Spain. The attack was the third of its kind in Europe alone. The earlier two instances of truck drivers willfully driving into crowds occurred in Nice in France and in Berlin in Germany. Last week, a man stabbed two women to death at a railway station in Marseille in France. All the attacks were by Islamist criminals. In the country which is at the helm of the anti-terror war being waged in the Middle East and supported by European nations, the United States, it's quite a different picture. There are other instances of violence, but not Islamist terror attacks. Let's break down where, how many, and importantly, why. Let's compare the United States with Europe as far as Islamist terror is concerned. The terror attack on 9/11 took 3,000 casualties. Between 2001 and 2017, there were only 94 casualties. In Europe, between 2001 and 2017, there were 637 casualties. Security analysts point to a curious factor. The United States leads the war against Islamist terrorism across the world and in its epicenter in Afghanistan, Pakistan. It is several times larger than Europe. Its cities are far more densely populated. And yet, the United States has yet to see a mass attack with a weapon as everyday as a truck, as has been the case in Europe. But there is one weapon in the United States which is almost as easily available as a killer truck, a gun. For long, gun control laws have been fiercely debated, but little has been done. The tragic killing of more than 50 people, with more than 100 seriously injured at a music concert in Las Vegas, was at the hands of a man who rained bullets down upon the crowd and was later killed by the police himself. And no, he was not an Islamist terrorist, is what we know, but a man called Stephen, whom the police described as a local resident. Now let's look at the modes of terror in the United States and in Europe. In the 2001, that is the 9/11 attack, it was a hijack and it were air crashes that were the primary modes of terror in the United States. As for guns, there are 10,000 homicides and 20,000 suicides every year. In Europe, on the other hand, trucks driven through crowded markets, attacks on music halls, public transport and taking hostages have been the most common modes of terror between 2001 and 2017. But if the United States is an industrialized economic superpower, so are the states of the European Union. And yet there are differences in both the nature of terror as well as the laws to deal with it. Let's look at the structures in the United States and in Europe. In the United States, there is unified intelligence sharing and law enforcement between individual US states. In Europe, there is a lack of routine intelligence sharing and coordination between individual EU countries. In the US, there's tough homeland security at entry to the United States. There are uniform laws in all the states, and the distance from the Middle East is greater than in Europe. In Europe, there are open, porous borders and differing laws in individual EU states, and the continent is much closer to the Middle East. In the United States, there are 90 million weapons in private possession due to lax gun control laws. In Europe, automatic weapons have been banned. 10% of Europeans own firearms, whereas 41% of Americans have guns. It's also the nature of public discourse that varies. Let's take a look at public support in the United States compared to Europe. In the United States, there is nearly 100% support for zero-tolerance anti-terror policies, whereas there's only 55% support for stricter gun control policies. In Europe, civil liberty activists put stops on surveillance, stress privacy laws, but there is majority support for stricter gun control policies. And finally, there are more Western Europeans fighting along with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria as compared to the United States. Only about 100 Americans joined the renegade terror group, while almost 4,000 Europeans have traveled to join the Islamic State. While the US Muslim population overall is less than 1% of the total population and better integrated, the European Muslim population ranges from between 5 and 10% of the population. And with the influx of refugees escaping the wars that the same West has created and Europe's welcome all policies based on human rights, that number is swelling exponentially. But with the worst killings since 9/11 taking place in Las Vegas in the United States last night, America may now be facing a new old enemy, its own gun culture. Padma Rao, WION.